The roots of a maple tree are mistaken for the reanimated corpses of the damned, crawling desperately to the surface of the earth to wreak havoc on the living. A fine layer of mist is the soul of a long-lost lover, hopelessly trapped between two planes of existence. Cemeteries have a reputation for being eerie places where our imaginations can be stimulated to a point of extreme dread. Vampires in hoods and cloaks lurk in the shadows, ready to attack. Demons use stone angels as conduits, and a headstone with a werewolf's teeth outlined by the moon's phosphorescent light. Few people can enter a cemetery in the middle of the night without getting a chill or two, even one as completely ordinary as the Palestine Cemetery. This place in particular was nothing special, but Jax Mercer wasn't plagued by such childish worries because he had visited it so frequently that it was impossible to frighten him. The Palestine Methodist Church was right down the road, and there was a small collection of gravestones, some new and some old, scattered in vases with the occasional rose. However, Jax's lack of fear was not due to his sheer bravery. He knew that the cemetery itself was not a threat, but rather the surrounding woods. He was a huge man, 6 feet 5 inches, and his tattoo-laden arms were as thick as tree trunks, and one hand could easily crush a watermelon. 37 years of age had given his face a hard, brutal look, making his sparse stubble strangely noticeable. Not that he cared, he wasn't a man of hygiene at all. Why would he be? He had no wife to please nor anyone to please for that matter, except for the lark. On the night the lark called on him for the nth time, he was sitting on his termite-ridden couch at home watching a late night's John Wayne movie. He was in a fine mood. His naturally stormy countenance had taken on a look of contentment. The single red rose, the one souvenir of last month's disaster, had been cast into the fireplace not too long earlier. He wouldn't be plagued by sentiment of unnatural guilt any longer. Furthermore, Jax loved Weston. He practically worshipped actors such as Wayne Eastwood and Cooper, and to enlighten his mood even more, he had a woman for hire coming over at 1 a.m. Just in time for his movie to be over. Cheryl, her name, was a flirting blonde goddess of a woman according to the Craigslist ad. Anyway, things couldn't have been going better than the lark called upon him just as it said it would so many years ago. He knew the call would come soon, but he'd shoved the possibility into the back of his mind. If he'd remembered and fully realized the proximity of his hour, it would have laid wreckage to his sunny disposition. His perfect night was ruined when the lark's voice pierced his brain like a slug from a high-caliber pistol. It hurt like hell, but it usually did. And all of a sudden, he was on the ground, writhing uncontrollably, with his eyes rolling up into his head. He saw nothing but darkness, and he felt nothing but convulsions running up and down his body like liquid fire sing through the marrow of his bones. The lark spoke in a foreign language that Jax shouldn't have understood, but he did it because he had a very important task ahead of him, one that, if left unattended, would cause the tragic deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Every night as the residents of the town lay soundly in their beds, Jax was the unsung hero of the community. Although they were unaware of it, they owed Jax everything. Jax went to the rear shed, opened it, and went inside before turning on the light. The scent emanating from underneath the rotting wood was nothing short of repugnant. It appeared as if a raccoon had trapped himself in a tight space between the bottom of the shed's flooring and the uneven ground below. Jax didn't mind. He was used to the reek of festering court, not from his job as the local gravedigger, but from the burden he'd been victim to for years now. Scanning the shelves, he found what he was looking for: a shovel, a large heavy-duty flashlight, and a coil of rope. The first time he'd made his ritualistic drive to the Palestine Cemetery, he'd been as nervous as a kindergarten on the first day of school. His churning stomach had been tied in several complex knots, his sweaty hands had gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his lower lip was being bit with such ferocity, but it had turned white. All that had changed now. He may well have been going to the supermarket for a carton of milk. For all of the emotion he showed, it was a short drive, no less than 5 minutes long. As soon as he passed the church, Jax turned his high beams on and pulled into the grass rolling through the short pasture between the church and the graveyard. No one saw him. The road was practically abandoned on every day save for Sunday. He parked his pickup as close to the graveyard as he possibly could. As soon as the deed was done, he found it was best to get back home as fast as he possibly could. No sense in walking the extra 50 yards to the road, best to just get it over with as quickly as possible in and out, and then go home and watch Clint Eastwood waste Le Van Cleave, all the while you try not to think about what you just did, especially after what happened last time. The cemetery didn't scare him, but Jack shivered nonetheless as the memory permeated his mind. He shook himself, cleared his head, and grabbed the equipment out of the back of his truck. The long grass swished impatiently about his feet. He'd have to cut it soon, preferably next Monday when he was well rested and fit as the gravedigger of this establishment. It was what they paid him for. With an expert flick of Jack's thumb, the flashlight burst to life, providing a small ray of illumination, which he used to look at the headstones. Henderson. He was looking for the tombstone labeled Shelley Henderson, although in reality Shell wasn't the one lying on the soft white fabric of the casket. The rotting remains of Shelley Henderson were now slowly dissolving in a pool of stomach acid. The beam of light danced across the cemetery until it found what it was looking for, heading over to the grave in order to cast a ray of light over the area he would be digging. Jack placed his torch on the ground and propped it up slightly on the rope coil. He then raised the shovel and stopped, knelt, and brought the tool's round point closer to his face. His stomach dropped about a foot, but his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. A maroon speck that he had somehow missed was encrusted into the rusty metal, so he stretched a thumbnail and scratched until it was gone. With that out of the way, he, as anticipated, given that this grave had only been excavated a month prior, Jack drove the blade deeply into the ground, and it moved through the dirt with ease. Jack grinned. Riley's first attack of the evening wasn't too severe, but there would undoubtedly be more over the course of 3 long hours for the typical group of 2 to 3 men. The exhumation procedure would take about 5 hours, but Jack's was a hardy individual who worked quickly. 2 hours later, he was 4.5 feet deep in the ground, and he was already starting to perspire a lot. Sweat was running down the bridge of his nose, giving the Roman gladiator who had been inserted into his left bicep a fresh slick sheen of fluid. He wiped at his brow absent-mindedly and continued the pack of chewing tobacco that he jammed into his lower lip was growing heavier. He spat once, letting some of the juice drip down his chin, and then kept digging. He struck the concrete of the burial vault seal no less than an hour later. Breaking in wasn't a problem. That part was done already. Within seconds he was staring down at the black steel of the casket. He breathed in and let out a shaky breath. The hardest part of this entire operation was moments away. He had no trouble handling dead bodies, otherwise his job would be difficult. He did, however, have trouble working up the courage to open the lid of that casket. Looking down at the face of the young boy he'd murdered, that was going to be difficult. He took a moment to reminisce. It was last month, July, when he killed him. He didn't want to, but he wasn't given much choice in the matter. On that night, an especially nasty thunderstorm was forming. In the distance, the occasional flashes of heat lightning served as a natural malfunctioning lantern as he dug. Music, feverishly beseeching the earth for the corpse of Shelley Henderson, an elderly woman who died only last month. By midnight the storm was upon him, bullet-shaped. Stinging raindrops ceaselessly battered the blackened clouds. The water loosened the soil, making digging much easier than it had been before. The deep rumble of thunder shook the air. In a matter of minutes, he discovered the same black steel casket for the first time. The grave was flooding quickly, and his ankles were already submerged in lukewarm summer rainwater. Placing one knee on the bottom part of the casket. In the beginning, he always needed special equipment to open the caskets, but he had since learned that he could use his own sheer power. Overall, Mrs. Shelley Henderson didn't look that horrible. He slipped his fingers beneath the lid and threw it open, exposing the corpse inside. After a month underground, her lips shriveled back to reveal dry yellow teeth, and her mouth was twisted downward in a post-mortem frown. Blistered brownish-yellow skin had sunken into the bones of her aged face. Her white hair was starting to come out in thick clumps, and worst of all, her closed eyes appeared oddly vacant, like bare sockets with 2 thin layers of rotting. Jack felt the awful, uncontrollable need to get a needle and pierce one eye hole because the flesh was stretched across them and sloppily sewed together. He thought that if he did, the flesh would slide apart and off her head completely. She had been buried in a gorgeous white dress with pricey lace, so the casket itself probably wasn't too. Somebody or someone had invested a great deal of effort and money to provide her a restful sleep. When his mother passed away 15 years ago, Jax had made similar actions and felt a glimmer of pity. He nearly felt guilty for upsetting Shell's last resting place. Jack almost slit his fingers as he had done so many times before. Beneath the corpse's shoulder, the bare skin had adhered to the lining's fabric. Ironically, he was always as careful as he could be with the bodies, even though the eventual destruction would be devastating. To his dismay, some of Shell's skin peeled and left a slimy residue on the expensive fabric, but whatever, he held her in his arms like an overgrown newborn, pulled her out of her shell, lifted her, and kindly placed her on the level ground above his dirt pile. When Jax climbed out of the grave and saw him, he was just thinking about how he would need to shift the body swiftly. The child's name was Ronnie Blakely, but Jax didn't know him at all or even personally. In fact, he didn't find out until later that week when he read about his disappearance in the newspaper with shaking fingers. He was a short, little man, especially in comparison to Jack, and his face was marred by the adorable features of childhood, like freckles and chubby features. Someone like Shelley Henderson probably pinched his cheeks occasionally. His chestnut brown hair was partially hidden by the hood of his yellow rain slicker, and he was holding a single red rose, a rose that Jax would eventually destroy in his fireplace, in his hands. He was looking at Jax, half frightened, half confusion, and his tiny green eyes kept darting from his frozen form, one knee on solid ground, the other leg still in the hole to the nearby body. Oh God, why couldn't it have been an adult who had walked in on him? All kids ever did in Jax's experience was talk, and from the look of it, this particular child had quite a story to tell. When he did, Jack would undoubtedly go to jail, and the town of Palestine would be doomed. As Jax looked at Ronnie, who was silently assessing him from a distance, a ball of energy started to form in his chest. The energy extended to his arms, legs, and entire body. He understood what needed to be done, but did he have the strength to carry it out? A single word sparked the chase. Jax quickly grabbed the shovel from next to the torch and wrenched himself out of the opening when Ronnie's lip trembled just enough. Ronnie spun around and took off running. Jax's wet feet squished against the soles of his boots as he stamped frantically into the marshy grass. It didn't take him long to catch up to his height and build. When he raised the shovel over his head, both of them were still running. When he brought it down, he concentrated all of his strength on this one fatal swish, and all of a sudden, every bone in Jax's body felt drained. He gently wrenched the shovel downward, and it released itself from the child's head. He closed his eyes and only heard the thud of the body hitting the ground. He went to his truck, got inside, and locked the door. There was a bottle of vodka in the glove compartment. He was the man's best friend when making important decisions. He had the option to leave Palestine immediately and never return, but instead he chose not to consider the devastation that would result from doing so. He was a good man, and his mother, may God bless her, had brought him up better than to act in such a cowardly manner. There was only one option, and that was the right one. An hour and a half later, Shelley Henderson had been fed to the LCK, and Ronnie was 6 feet underground, lying in a bed of eternal sleep. His slumber would soon be broken, though, because the lark liked fresh bodies, and he must have run out of graves to dig. That was a frightening thought, and JX did his best to ignore it because he believed in the adage, do what you can while you can, and if you have a problem, wait until it presents itself instead of worrying about it. He had taken one item from the boy, a single red rose, to preserve some of his innocence that would otherwise have been wiped off the face of the earth. Jax came to the realization that it felt like only last week that search parties had been sent out and that Ronnie's pathetic faux funeral had taken place only a few yards from the location of his real body. Jax couldn't help but find it because it was so ironic and darkly humorous. He gazed down at the coffin containing the lark's monthly sustenance. After taking a deep breath and allowing the cool air to fill his lungs, he wrenched the boy's next to last resting place open with a single, quick, perfect motion, bending down and hooking his fingers underneath the lid. Jax felt sick to his stomach, not because of the body itself, but because he was the one who had caused this once living creature to lie motionless. Carefully, he put a finger on Ronnie's shoulder and pressed the skin underneath, which was strangely music. Ronnie had fared even better than Shelley Henderson. In fact, he was almost exactly the same as he was while he was alive. The walk into the woods was the easiest part. You just had to hold the corpse like your one true love in your arms before heading out. In less than 5 minutes, Jax arrived at a clearing in the forest with a deep incline that led into a huge abyss of mud and slime about 50 feet across. He laid the body out on the ground in a proper position for the upcoming task. He smelt the lock before he saw it, which he always did as much as he'd been around the dank stench of decomposing and even bloated calves. The smell of the LCK always managed to make him wrinkle his nose in disgust. It was ozone mixed with warm rotted eggs and a strong touch of the sewers. The ground beneath Jax's feet shook a little, so he stepped back, wary of his surroundings. One of his worst fears was that he had fallen into the pit by accident, in which case everything would be lost in many ways. Then, from the chasm of filth below, there was a low, gentle stirring in the muck that was beginning to emit a low hum as it bubbled gently at first, then more violently as it progressed into a full gargle complete with the buildup of fizz. Near the outer rims of the pool of sludge, a single black tentacle emerged from the slime, sleek, shiny, and smooth. Like the tail of an enraged lion testing the night, the reptilian rope swished through the air. Apparently, it enjoyed this sensation since more 10, 20, 40 quickly joined it. A cool hand of assurance touched Jax's mind, causing him to close his eyes and clench his fists. It was an illusion, all illusions made by that beast in the ground, the same illusion that had enticed him into the woods all those years ago, forcing him into that deal. A series of high shrill-pitched clicks echoed off the trees, and it was laughter. Jax couldn't keep track of their number, and they all vibrated energetically, revealing the source of the bubbling and fizzling. Jax could do nothing but swallow his pride and push the comfort to the edges of his consciousness, forcing himself to face the cruel truth of the world. There was no consolation here. He hated the lark, and the lark would destroy him without a second thought. That was all. It was several years ago when they'd first met. Jax was young and naive. The lark must have known this. It must have been able to sense that such minds are easier to twist and pervert, because now he was on the low end of a high stakes deal for the rest of his years. Every month one exhumed body for the Lar, and if the Lar didn't get what he wanted, Palestine would be razed. How fair. Bitterly Jax spit what remained of his tobacco. A tired sense of rage was expanding in his being, starting in his heart and working its way throughout his veins. Jax was exhausted, plain and simple, exhausted of giving so much to people who'd given him so little. Exhausted of the constant boring cycle that his life had become, exhausted of knowing that there was no escape. In a single romp of pathetic and doleful fury, Jax charged forward and kicked Ronnie's body squarely in the sternum, sending him plummeting into the emptiness where 1,000 water moccasins appeared to be crawling over the body, especially in the moonlight. Within a minute, he was engulfed by both muck and tentacles. When Jax's work here was finished, he turned to go. There weren't many tombstones left in the Palestine cemetery, so he knew what he would do when he ran out. He could probably get bodies from other cemeteries, but moving them would be too much work. Besides, few cemeteries were as remote as this one. Jack considered how simple it had been to kill Ronnie with a single, quick blow to the head. Could it be too hard to do that again? The rose was burned, turned to ashes, dust to dust, and no more guilt? Yes. He could probably do it more than once, probably multiple times. In fact, once the Palestine cemetery was no longer useful to him, he might even be caught.